We ready? All right, so welcome everybody back. So we are at our very last session today. So learning about our community, and it is going to be facilitated by Alex Richardson and Deborah Maurer. And so I'm just going to pass the baton off to you two and let you guys take our last hour. Thank you very much.
No pressure. Thanks, Michael. So, well, good afternoon, everyone. I think it's comfortably afternoon for everyone on the call now, so I won't screw that up again. So nice to see everybody back. Uh, I'll I'll do a couple of introductions, and Deborah and I each want to say a little bit to kind of frame up our discussion. But as in some of the other discussions, we're really interested in having the audience kind of set the agenda and help us think through what I think are some really nice overarching relevant questions for our entire community. Be you a coach, a participant, an organizer, or sort of working behind the scenes like Deborah and I. More organizationally. So I'm Alex Richardson. I'm an associate director at the Prindle Institute for Ethics at DePaul University in Indiana, which is the institutional home of API, which is the institutional home of the IEB, which is a really long sentence with lots of dependent clauses. But I've been involved with Ethics Bowl, suffice it to say, for a very long time, for the better part of the last decade. And really am a believer in its sort of power, both in the classroom and out, to deliver really, really interesting goals and objectives for students, for things that they take seriously, for things that I value as an educator, and for things that make them sort of better citizens and better people. So I want to say a little bit to kind of frame up our discussion in that way, and then I'll pass off to Deborah to do the same. Just to pull back the curtain a little bit here, our organization team for this workshop kind of went back and forth about whether to nominally say out loud that this session was about assessment, which is a very unsexy word that hopefully doesn't dissuade you from listening and talking with us. So I'd really like to frame the conversation that's about to happen in the following way. As a kind of extension about conversations that have been ongoing throughout the weekend about very precisely what the value of the thing that we are doing as a community together is. I'll say, just by way of kind of background and introduction, that we all likely have had good experiences with Ethics Bowl. If we haven't yet and we're joining and getting oriented to it for the first time, you soon will. You'll figure it out. There is a kind of it factor. There's something kind of magical, many of us believe, that happens when you're in the room at an Ethics Bowl. This is part of the reason that we focused our first session on demonstration. It's really interesting to sort of see it work in real time. But I want to frame up this conversation as getting really specific about the things that we think are valuable. We've seen this in kind of anecdata ways have really transformative impacts on students across the lifespan, be they high school students, college students, and of course, we're extending the activity continually. I know we have another session tomorrow in Ethics Bowl Beyond the Classroom. At least some of that conversation will revolve around doing Ethics Bowl style activity with adults, either as professional training programs or as programs meant to engage retirees and the incarcerated and folks who our society often sort of forgets about. But it's also skewing younger, right? Increasingly being used to engage middle school students and younger as well. And so there are core kind of through lines, I think, in terms of skills and dispositions and the sort of ethics bowliness of our activity that run really across all of those contexts. So I want us to conceive of the session and the conversation that follows as a kind of invitation to get really clear and specific about what those things are, what those things look like, either in competitive venues or in our classrooms, and more importantly, what it looks like when those things go well, right? What are the success conditions for our activity? What does it look like for students, for instructors, for organizers, for coaches to do it and to do it well? So in that way, the session is sort of about assessment, but what it really is about, from my own perspective here, is answering questions about the values that we all already take seriously, and making those conversations more precise and hopefully more rigorous. So with that sort of rambly introduction, I'll pass things off to Deborah to sort of frame us up a little more. And then we have a few kind of discussion questions to kind of get us started and structure things, but we're very interested in hearing what you all have to offer on this point. So Deborah, take things away.
Fantastic. So for those of you who are just joining us, because I see a couple new faces who weren't with us earlier today, I'm Deborah Maurer, and I'm the director of the Center for Practical Ethics at the University of Mississippi. I'm also a member of APPE, and I've been involved in ethics bowl for over 20 years. And one of the things that Alex just said, I think is really important. This is where I want you to kind of maybe reach back in your memory, or if Ethics Bowl is new to you, think about what you've noticed today or you've been observing today. But my very first experience with the Ethics Bowl was when I was asked to judge at the national competition in 2007. I didn't know anything about the bowl. I was thrown into a round because they needed judges. We were shorthanded, and they said, "Will you do this?" And I thought, "Okay, I'll volunteer," right? And I was in my very first round, and I was enthralled because here I was in a setting where really thoughtful students were engaging in civil conversation about complex political questions and coming up with proposals for how to solve them and delving into the details and considering perspectives from all walks of life and really doing nuanced work that I don't see on the part of most politicians. And so it gave me a profound sense of hope for our entire democracy, that we've got new generations of students coming up through the pipeline and extending across the lifespan who have these kinds of skills and capacities. And so I'd like you to just start by reflecting on your experience today or the experiences that you've had with the Ethics Bowl, and think perhaps about what it is that you find most inspiring about the bowl. We've talked some about the values, but for you, what is it that you think is of ultimate import in this practice of Ethics Bowl and the engagement of students and faculty and coaches in these conversations? And so that's really where we want to start the conversation today, is the assumption that all of us have, or the belief or the intuition that all of us have, that there is something really valuable here. And so let's start there with an explicit question, which we want to pull from all of you, which is, when we're thinking about Ethics Bowl as being something that students are engaging in and that we're teaching students as educators, what is it that we think very specifically that they're learning or they're gaining? Or conversely, what are the skills or abilities that coaches and judges are also practicing and developing? So we're just going to open the floor, and we want to hear you. Go ahead and feel free to raise your hands. And we'll call on you, or people can just go ahead and start. We'll keep track of a queue. Jordan, please go ahead and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
You can.
Awesome. One thing that I appreciate seeing, that I usually always see and I think is really important, is at the beginning, like when students just hear feedback on their positions or they hear a counter argument, that looks very different at the beginning of Ethics Bowl than it does like towards the end by the time they're in competition. So I think just abilities to handle criticism, abilities to respond to it in a very sincere and civil way, where you're interested in really getting to the bottom of something rather than winning or looking like the smartest person in the room.
Jordan, that's really fantastic. And I'm glad that you raised the capacity of being able to respond to criticism and handle criticism. If you were thinking about the ways that you've seen students do that well, or maybe even coaches do that well when they're getting feedback about their team performance, what is it that they're doing? Like what makes that response so good? Like what does responding to criticism well look like?
Yeah, if it's a question for me, I mean, I think it was really on display during the match earlier today. I thought just sort of like measured, civil kind of responses. I think oftentimes just pointing out where you agree, where you see the differences. I think, yeah, things like that kind of stick out to me.
It's really helpful to think about criticism as finding those points of agreement, which is a really insightful way of thinking about what it is for us to track and how it is that we can know that we've been successful. Is our students able to find those points of agreement, and how can we measure their response to this kind of feedback? We've got a comment in the chat. The most valuable experience for me as a student was getting to interact with other students from all over the country. Good. That there's a lot of goodwill and unity. Yeah, that's a fantastic comment. Is there a way that we could try to track what students are actually learning through that kind of gaining of goodwill or showing unity? And so to Jazzy, I'm going to ask you if you can keep thinking about that. Taz has got a question, but if you can think about that question more and help us understand a little bit more about how we might track and learn more about when students are really getting that, when they're doing it well. Taz.
Right. I think another good point to measure some sort of success is also seeing where previous coaches, debaters, and participants are able to come back and still continue their work, whether as moderators, as coaches, and as judges. So is this experience as a debate or as a debater so fulfilling and enriching that they can still come back and continue or start teams in high school, middle school levels and continue the conversation for ethics in not just their community, but also as a member of the community.
Good. Taz, that's awesome. I have never thought about tracking longitudinal engagement of people being
Retention.
competitors.
Yeah.
Right, across time, as Alex says, retention, but also it's a measure of interest, and it's a reflection of commitment. And so tracking interest, commitment through retention is a genius idea to show that this is a community that really cares, right? Because people keep coming back, they keep being involved in ways that maybe we don't have the same kind of retention across other kinds of activities. Good, fantastic idea.
Can I offer a brief thought on the sort of like goodwill and unity theme? One of the things that I've often struggled with when thinking about kind of evaluating what we're doing is whether whether and how the idea of building consensus is in fact the goal, right? Is the goal to sort of triangulate a kind of middling position on a thing, right? And this is often this is a thing that like a lot of coaches and organizers often struggle with when I think John Garcia mentioned this sort of framing earlier. We're thinking about like what questions to engage and what questions are settled and what questions are open, right? These types of considerations like often kind of inform what we're after, right? Like, are we doing the kind of like, maybe broadly political task of like manufacturing a kind of consensus? Like, is that the goal? Is that like what we're getting at with goodwill and unity, or is it unity on the value of the method, right? And so I think like one of the sort of most often like assessment question that pops up is like, how do we think about the distinction between form and content, right? And like what is the content that we're chasing down versus what is the sort of like method that we take with us through all these interesting contexts, right? And I think we can assess along both of those vectors, but I'm often sort of vexed on this idea of like whether what we actually should be trying to do is manufacture a certain kind of agreement on fundamentals.
So I think that's a really fantastic question, and I'm hoping that folks have some thoughts about it. I was in the last session where we were discussing, how to be a coach, set up teams and considerations for what you do with teams. And for those of you who weren't able to be in that session, one of the points of conversation was, how do you make sense of the idea that a team has a unitary position, right? And what do you do with cases where members of a team don't all share the same position? And I think this is a broader question from the standpoint of learning about our community, because we do have broad disagreements even within one team, and we have broad disagreements across teams. And so what does unity look like? And how would we know that we've done some kind of unity well? Is it consent on agreement, or is it just working together on a project? Is it coming up with compromise positions? What does that look like? So Tajowski, I hope that you've continued to think about your goals here, because I'm really curious about this question. Nathan has got a fantastic comment in the chat. The professionalism and the mannerism displayed by students, coaches, and staff in the mock competition. Yes, I think everybody did a fantastic job. Displayed a format that shows respect and acknowledgement. So, yeah, Nathan, that's a fantastic point. Do you have any additional thoughts on how we show that we've inculcated that successfully? And one of the reasons why Alex and I wanted to run this session and get people's feedback, right, get your input, is there's a lot of people across the country that are really interested in civil discourse right now, particularly given the complex political environment in which we are. And as members of this Ethics Bowl community, we, like perhaps all of you, think that there's something really special that the Ethics Bowl offers. But it's hard to make that case that we're doing something really unique if we can't show that we're doing something really unique. How do we prove to other people that we're doing something really unique and very special with the Ethics Bowl in how we engage with each other? So Nathan, if you have more thoughts on the demonstration of professionalism or mannerism, beyond just scores, because that's what's most obvious to me, but if you've got more thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it. Okay, John, I also have a comment. Well, Alex, I'm going to go ahead and have you maybe turn to, oh, we've got a whole bunch of points coming up in the comment section. How about you all just, rather than putting a lot of comments in the text, let's go ahead and share those with the whole group, because there's some really interesting things happening in the chat. So John, Nathan, and Jordan all have fabulous points to raise. All right, Brooke, take it away.
Thank you. One of the ways you can tell that there is some success is to look at what you're doing for those of us who are working on textbooks or doing our own teaching. And one of the things that really impressed me in my first acquaintance with the Ethics Bowl was that I was focusing in my online text that I'm working on how how you can teach a person what their processes and their criteria are for making ethics decisions and decisions on how to act, and also resolving disagreements with others. And as I sat through the first couple of rounds I listened to, I realized I'm leaving out this agreement stuff. And the agreement stuff is really important, because if I understand how what it is that makes me agree with the other person, they may in fact have arrived at the same conclusion I have, but using a different process or a different standard for that. And so my understanding of that, of what's right in this situation, would grow by understanding that there are various ways of coming at this particular case, and not just the one that I have. And so I have a whole nother section in my textbook about that now, about agreement. So thank you very much for for this Ethics Bowl experience, because it does make a difference.
Mm-hmm. So Brooke, that's a really interesting point, which I hadn't considered. Is one way to maybe demonstrate the success of the bowl is just to track and show the level of agreement, which might be really different than other methods and other approaches that people are doing on college campuses or other types of bowls or other competitions like debate, right? And Jordan, you've got some really interesting points in the chat. Do you want to go ahead and share those points and then expand?
Sure. I feel like I've talked enough already, so I'll try to be quick. But basically, I just in response to Alex's question, which is a really good one, had me kind of thinking. Yeah, maybe I'll summarize by thinking about an experience I had coaching, where we were talking about a case for the regional bowl, and everybody on the team kind of seemed to agree that like there's an obvious kind of answer here, and it's a matter of just coming up with the right justification for the obvious answer, and then we get into a match and hear another side. The students are surprised. Wait, people actually think that. And I think that what had happened is maybe in practice, I kind of let this consensus position kind of develop, and I wasn't careful about it. And so, and I think like, oh, did I, alienate these students and maybe, thought the other sort of thing. And so that's something, I wanted to be more careful of. But yeah, it can happen, even if you're not trying to let it happen. And what I just, really want, I think, at the end of the day, isn't for them to think any particular thing, but to just have skills and tools that allow them to hear the other side, engage with the other side, take the other side, even if they're not sincere, if they don't sincerely hold it, but at least understand it. And just really like have the skills and tools to engage in back and forth debate with one another.
Yeah, that's good. Another thing I often sort of ask myself about, I mean, I guess it's sort of, imagine it on another end of a spectrum where manufacturing consent is not consent, but consensus is one end. The other is something like, is it the purpose of programming like this to like encourage students to change their minds? Not exactly, right? The idea is something like choreographing an openness to doing so. I mean, so one of the metrics that as a leadership team we've started to show some interest in is something like intellectual humility. Which, I mean, philosophers and psychologists, both internally and to their disciplines and between those two disciplines, have, I think, protracted arguments about the nature of, right? But one of the sort of most straightforward ways of describing that intellectual virtue is simply something like Deborah mentioned at the very top of our conversation today when she was introducing the sort of values of the bull, which is something like mere openness to revision, right? And I think so, like, maybe that's one sort of measure where we can get serious about getting at like what it means for students to take an opposing view seriously, not merely to hear it, but in fact listen to it, integrate it, learn from it.
Yeah, I think that the idea of maybe tracking openness to ideas, but also whether or not ideas are revised. And that's something that, we do have structured in the bowl, especially with the response to commentaries. But that would be a
Right.
really neat way of demonstrating to folks outside our community that we're doing something quite unique and distinctive, and the students are really gaining some powerful skills in ways that they're not
Right.
perhaps in debate.
Yeah, I mean, as a correlate, right? Just to put that sort of external communication point vividly, I think speech and debate cultivates lots of intellectual virtues. I seldom think that humility is one of them.
Edison, I see you've got your hand raised. Please take it away.
Thank you. Yes, and I'd like to follow up on the point just made that some of the interest in debate that I've seen has been debate for its own sake, and then there can be no stakes placed on the table, especially if you're a certain kind of person debating. One of the things that got me into ethics bowl from right off the bat was recognizing that the values that were mentioned at the start of this workshop were in place and being used. Having intellectual humility for sure, but also authenticity and actually learning from things. Like, I don't think, or some people are very bad at having political charged conversations. And one of the skills that's built into Ethics Bowl is having those good conversations. And part of that is not just being good at debate, but having those auxiliary values. Or I shouldn't say auxiliary values, but maybe they seem auxiliary to debate. And so I guess that was the point I wanted to make. I also wanted to shout out John Hoglin's comment in the chat that I thought was very good, and tied into what I was saying.
One of the things that this series of comments makes me think of is another thing that I've sort of like Deborah mentioned this earlier when she sort of situated us within this like really complex and by many lights worsening political climate and like almost embarrassing state of public discourse in some cases. So I hesitate to tie our assessment metrics to anything that's sort of explicitly political and explicitly recreating some assumptions about that climate. But one of the things that that I think about, that I was thinking about as I was listening to your comment, Edison, is whether and how we might think of Ethics Bowl as a tool to combat something like polarization. In particular, right, like this idea of sort of like maybe it's a kind of flip side of humility, right? The humble don't dig in, the humble don't dogmatize, right? And so like I'm interested in what folks in the community think about this sort of metric. In particular, like the risk of tying our evaluation metrics to something kind of overtly political, something that sort of like admits as a framing device, like a crappy political climate, right? Which there might be virtues too, but there are also risks associated with, right? Because I know one of the things that my former colleagues at the PAR Center have done some interesting things with high school students on something like affective polarization, with like the way that you, not necessarily political polarization, but affective, meaning like the way that you sort of feel about the moral status of your interlocutor, right? Whether you consider them in some ways like, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but whether you consider them people in a live sense, or whether you consider them sort of like, you know, stand-ins for a view that you hate, right? So I'm kind of like in the name of getting more specific about some metrics and measures, right? Where humility is maybe one of them, but some of these other sort of externally communicable sort of things, right? It strikes me that like polarization is a kind of interesting frontier here. Yeah, it has.
So I'm almost wondering if instead of measuring, having metrics that specifically look at discourse, whether it's very political or very legal, I think some of the discussion in one of the panels a while ago was this idea of diversity, right? Not just the idea of students from a very just like a philosophy department or political science or communications department, but also having students from engineering departments or having students from other sciences be just as involved in the ethics role as a marker for how broad these discussions are, how not specific to certain departments these discussions are, because breadth of the cases does span over various different cultural, political, legal, and moral issues. So then, having representation from students or coaches or even judges and moderators who are from different disciplines could be a good indicator or just a marker for how these discussions of ethics and morals can go past just specific departments and different disciplines. So maybe there is something to be said in looking at those numbers, looking at diversity as an assessment for participants versus just, does this help lend to conversations about political matters or discourse that are happening?
How do we measure that though? Like that's what I'm like, I hate to insist on that, right? But I mean, like I'm trying to triangulate between like, external to community like metric fetishism, which I think is like a symptom of like what it is to work in like higher education and simply and education as a sector more broadly, right? We have an unhealthy obsession with, I think, metricization and assessment in that way, but also like we can't simply communicate the value of our activity based on vibes, right? Like, and so I want to no, and no, to dispel any doubt, the vibe is good, right? But like I really like I'm struggling to get a handle on what that like exposure to diversity of views sort of metric is, right? Because it's not mere exposure, that we
It
want.
would probably,
It's
let's say if we were to talk about data, it could just be an easy enough thing to calculate penetration in different disciplines versus just,
yeah,
you know, just high school students or college students that are very specific to certain departments. If it means that there are more engineering students that are participating,
Mhm.
what we could make the assumption that that translates to more engineers or more science-based fields that are also carrying on discussion for ethics and moral issues in things that they do in, let's say, biotech disciplines
Yeah.
versus just philosophy and communication or things that we see. I think
Deborah,
there's some data there, but I think that's a fair ask to say, how does that
yeah,
translate into an accessible number or metric for the community?
Deborah, Michael, do we have disciplinary data on participants in IEB?
I don't think that we do.
Not that I'm aware of.
And that would be an interesting question to ask our participants, which is, what are their majors?
Right.
Would be a really interesting thing to sort of track the reach across disciplines and departments, especially over time as the bowl grows. I
Right.
love this idea. But my caution as I'm sitting here listening to all this is I'm not certain that our reach would be different than, let's say, debate, or other
Yeah,
sorts of groups.
right.
So, what is it that we're doing with our reach across disciplines and getting students involved in these complex conversations that's so valuable, as Alex said, where it's not just, representation, but what are we doing with the engineering students that sort of get something or develop something in them? So I love this suggestion. I'm still trying to tweak in my own head what it would turn into. But Rachel might have a genius suggestion here.
Probably not. This is maybe going in a slightly different vein on the basis of some of the conversation that's taking place on the chat, and also thinking about what happened in the last session that Alex and I were in. One way, when I'm particularly successful as an ethics teacher, one sign that I feel like I've been successful is when students tell me that they've stopped engaging in tribalism, like that they now recognize that they had previously been engaging in tribalism, that they've just kind of believed whatever it felt like members of their group might think, or what their parents might think, and now they're more willing to consider issues more broadly, and they're willing to. I mean, one big difference that I see between people who I think are genuinely critical thinkers and those that aren't is the ability to assess reasons and to recognize that not all reasons are created equal. There are stronger arguments and there are weaker arguments and so on. So I'm wondering, yeah, kind of behavior change. I'm wondering if, just to connect this back up with what we were saying in the previous discussion about classrooms, is to do those people who are doing ethics bowl in the classroom in any of its forms might engage in a sort of assessment there, which is some sort of assessment according to which you're saying, giving them scenarios or something, and you could do a pre-test and a post-test or something, and kind of look into whether, I don't know exactly how you design this, but what are the reasons that you might, right? Assessing their ability to identify reasons rather to engage in political tribalism. Because I definitely, in my social ethics courses, right from the outset, you raise these sorts of issues in the early days. I'm sure a lot of us do this. Here are some practical and applied issues. What do you think about them? And then we'll jump into the theory and we'll do some applied readings or whatever throughout the course. And often they just thought what they always were going to think anyway in these long courses. So how do you know you're getting through to them? I mean, so in an ethics bowl course, that's one way you could assess. You'd have to think about exactly what they would look like, but.
So that's actually a good segue to the second kind of question that Deborah and I wanted to ask, which is to say, is the model that we should, what is the instrument? What is the model that we're using to do assessment work? Right. If it can't be vibes, but it also can't be we collect exhaustive analytics data on every move that students make. Right. So one of the things that we thought it would be helpful to think about in this venue together is something like what challenges are associated and what obstacles are associated with various like assessment measures, or not just measures, but instruments themselves, right? So like one of the things that I think is most like interesting about Ethics Bowl is that we all want to observe the very sort of it factor that Rachel just mentioned in participants over time, right? So that's going to require us to do like longitudinal intervention. It's going to require us to keep an audience stable. It's going to require the sample to be sort of replicable and similar year in, year out, right? There are lots of challenges with kind of holding on to students, participants. I mean, there are challenges with holding on to coaches that way, right? Much less in many cases students. So I want to think, I mean, you know, maybe the classroom context is a really interesting one because it involves a kind of captivity that often our activity more broadly may not, right? So like it may be that coaches who have coursework associated are more able to administer things like longitudinal surveys, right? Than I know there are lots of ethics bowl teams which are student run as clubs, right? It's very hard to keep those people in the same room, even for the purpose of practice, much less for the purpose of assessment, right? So I think like one of the things, yeah, our sort of next kind of genre of question is really about those kinds of challenges, right? The kind of like practical nitty gritty, like why can't we administer various kinds of assessment instruments? Or like what problems do we need to solve to do that? Like say we wanted to do, you know, a multi-time a year longitudinal study. What are the obstacles for ethics bowl coaches, for ethics bowl organizers to actually being able to do that?
So Alex, there's a really interesting question in the chat from Gisela.
Employment status. Yeah. Do you mean like, I mean, probably not like yes, no, employed, unemployed, right? But you're thinking about like what kinds of jobs they take?
And Gisela, maybe go ahead and jump in and just help fill out your question there, because I think it's a really interesting one.
Sure. So I'm very analytical. I'm an IT person. So for me, it's all about the numbers a lot of the time. And an assessment to me would be something like you guys keep saying, oh, it looks great on your resume. But how would we get that data to show that it actually does improve your chances of getting hired if you participate in these sorts of events versus not getting hired? And is that something that we can prove it, you know, with numbers, rather than just saying, we think it looks good on your resume. We're
Yeah.
assuming it looks good.
Yeah, I mean, this is
Something like that. Of course, it's difficult to do because then you're going to have you have the students who are maybe in a particular class, let's say,
Right.
the students who did participate in that class and the students who didn't participate in that class, right? And then afterwards, you're going to have to track them after they graduate, which is not the easiest task. But it's just a thought process. Like, how
Mhm.
could we make that happen so that we could, you know, on average, or, you know,
Mhm.
something like that, where it's kind of a, again, it's a little difficult, but yes,
Right.
yeah. All assessments are difficult, like
That's right.
like is being said. Yes, of course.
Yeah. I mean,
It's
so
just
one thing that
introducing something new.
yeah, one thing that really occurs to me there is worrying about like proven causation. I mean, so John put a comment in the chat about selection effect, right? It would not surprise me if we were able to get a sample that is basically lockstep with the number of students who participate in the Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl. It would not surprise me if they fared incredibly well on the sort of metric that universities use, right? You know, 99% of our graduates are employed within 6 months within their primary sector or something like that. It would not surprise me if IEB students blew that measure out of the water. The question, of course, is whether they do that because they were Ethics Bowl participants or whether the Ethics Bowl appeals to them because they are the kind of students for whom that would have been true anyway.
Yeah, I agree. But you know, a lot of assessments are a little bit difficult that way. And maybe if you had a little questionnaire for these people. They could be like, hey, I was, already blah, blah, blah. I don't know how we would get around that. In fact, most assessments are a little difficult in this way.
This is far-fetched, but Gisela, my mind is spinning now with possibilities, because this is a really interesting idea that I've never considered about employers and employment status. And it does still fall prey to the selection bias, but we've never thought about the possibility of just creating a voluntary assessment that anybody who has ever been part of Ethics Bowl could give to maybe someone who is a supervisor at an internship that they've done, or someone who is a current boss. A lot of employers do an end of year review, or at the end of a new employment, the end of a tenure period where they're evaluating. And so it would be really interesting if something on that assessment of their performance and skills in their job could be tied to the kinds of things and skills that we hope students are gaining from the Ethics Bowl, right? Like the ability to consider a variety of perspectives and ideas and evaluate and take criticism well. And some of these things that you all have mentioned, it strikes me that if we are thinking that behavior change is really important and is what we'd love to see, then a longitudinal study that looked at students who were involved in the Ethics Bowl by people who did observe them later, who said, oh my gosh, this new employee of mine is fantastic, is always raising great ideas in meetings, and is always presenting the other side, and is always offering helpful solutions or potential challenges to help us brainstorm and navigate problems ahead of time. What an amazing team. Like if we were to see something kind of like that. Now, it'd be entirely voluntary. There's a huge problem with self-selection bias, right? But I think, Gisela, I've never, ever thought about employers as a possible way to demonstrate the value of what we're doing. So interesting idea.
Thank you. I think it's, I always think about where it leads to down the road. I think after having taken one of the workshops on designing a course and thinking what you want them to remember 10 years later, and then working backwards from that was really kind of what switched my brain to thinking more long term rather than just what they're doing in school, for example.
Very nice.
Right. Can I ask a problem child question hopefully without derailing everything?
John, you're always a problem child.
As the resident problem child, you may you may ask the question.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about the fact that in most environments I find myself in with students, there's sort of two kinds of students, right, that participate in something. So I was an honors program coordinator for a decade, and there's a bunch of people who sort of go through the program and they take out of it what they can, but they're not heavily invested. And then there's another set of students that heavily invest in it, whose lives are fundamentally transformed by it. And, one thing that's interesting to me about this discussion is like, when you do quantitative assessments, you're trying to capture sort of everybody and what does the Ethics Bowl do for you by virtue of you having crossed paths with it. But it strikes me as sort of interesting that, like, what about just focusing on qualitative assessments of the people who found it most transformative? People who, like, I did the Ethics Bowl I'm looking at two people here who participated in the Ethics Bowl as a student 20 some years ago or whatever, and have now dedicated their lives to being, part of that community. And you hear from students all the time, this tremendously transformative power of it. And those are outliers, but to some extent, both from communicating the value of the bowl to others and to just thinking about what is the real value of it, it strikes me that maybe the real value is not every student we encounter, but the lives that are truly transformed by it. And so maybe that speaks to, focusing some efforts on targeting those people.
John, you're not a problem child. That's a really important thing to be thinking about, because you're right. We we have mistakenly assumed that this is a monolithic population. And you're right that there's differences, important differences
Yeah.
between at least two of these subsets.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think broadly speaking, the strategic question, the answer to that strategic question is let's do both and, right? Like let's think about what the things the rank and file can pull, but also like really qualitatively drill down on the diehards. So Rachel, Taz, I hope that means you're up for allowing us to like probe you, right? Like, you know, like there will be like attached electrodes and things like that.
I'm ready. I'm
weigh
ready.
in on that, Alex, at some point.
So Kuzawi, you got your hand up and next in the queue, so take it away.
I'm really, really glad that you brought that up, John, about the qualitative impacts, because this entire conversation, I was just thinking there is so much that Ethics Bowl has done for me, but I don't know if you can quantitatively measure how it has. Like, it means so much to me that I wrote my grad school essays about Ethics Bowl. And it was just paragraphs and paragraphs about like this amazing organization and everything it has done for me, but I don't know if there's any number that you can really put on that. So I wonder if there's any way we can just open the floor to students to submit their own essays or like their own thoughts on like ways it has transformed them, so we can kind of just collect quotes or like paragraphs here and there to really like make this quantitative, like almost like, I don't know what it would be, but a quantitative or qualitative work or body of things to demonstrate the impact.
So I love that idea, and thinking about how we could kind of collect those comments from students talking about the details of why it was transformative so important. I think having those would be fantastic. And Alex and I are certainly going to move forward on trying to collect all of that. So just being mindful of time, we do want to go ahead and switch. I know we've got multiple comments in the chat. Rachel had her hand up, but we're going to try to transition quickly to the next batch of questions. And one of the things that we're really interested in, again, is thinking about what is so unique and how to communicate that to folks outside the Ethics Bowl world, is we did a session on this at the API conference, and we had a lot of students who had been involved in Ethics Bowl at the high school level that had recently become part of Ethics Bowl at the collegiate level, and they were all philosophy majors. And a fascinating thing that came out in that conversation is they said, yes, Ethics Bowl is amazing, but you know, it's kind of what we're doing in our philosophy classes. And so Alex and I wanted to drill down on some of those intuitions, because showing that Ethics Bowl is doing something maybe different or that goes beyond what's done in philosophy classes. It's not just the critical thinking, it's not just the, right? And so thinking with this group, especially for maybe some of the students involved with us here today, who are philosophy majors, who've taken a lot of philosophy classes, can you tell us what it is that Ethics Bowl has done for you or offered for you or has been transformative for you or you've been valuable about it that goes beyond what you did or studied or learned or practiced in a philosophy class? And faculty too, if you've got thoughts, jump in. So Jordan's got an interesting comment in the chat, just learning more about ethics, which, yes, I think it's an excellent point, right? Just knowing more about ethics and then having that be fairly transformative, because you can use it in so many ways in your regular life, in every decision that you make. So that's a good point. Maggie, please.
I think the biggest difference between the Ethics Bowl, even like Ethics Bowl in a class or in like an intro class versus taking a philosophy class, is like Ethics Bowl isn't exclusive to philosophy people, you know? So it's like just by nature, there's more people involved, there's different perspectives, you're talking about different things. So I think that that opportunity to just have more voices involved, that's the biggest difference in my opinion.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, that brings me back to Taz's suggestion about sort of disciplinary penetration from earlier. I think one of the things I've been struggling to try and like describe exactly what this is, but like maybe I'll take a stab in it in a way as a way of getting us toward this kind of thing. One of the things that I always struggle with in even some of my upper level courses sometimes is getting students to thread discussions such that they are actually and genuinely responsive in ways that don't just involve like I'm going to contribute my slightly different thing and move us in a different direction in a way that doesn't actually hear or integrate the comment that came before me. One of the things that it strikes me as like fundamentally different about Ethics Bowl is that it is structured to be genuinely responsive and threaded in that way, such that you cannot be successful at it if you do the thing that students often do in a philosophy course, which is sort of like derail, right? And of course, they don't do it, and they don't often do it in, maybe some of them do, but they don't often do it on average, like insidiously or intentionally even, right? And so I think like there's a very different, it's not altogether different, but there is a distinct skill there that as a discipline, philosophy does not always do well at enculturating in students. In particular, I think like, I mean, we could probably attribute this to something like, you know, hyper specialization or the prevalent role of like objection and response kind of rhetoric in philosophy. But like this sort of like threadedness concern is not something that we as a discipline recreate and replicate well, right? This is something that even like early graduate students in philosophy struggle with, right? I mean, I'm thinking of like first year grad seminars where it gets kind of ugly, right? Where somebody, you know, here's my objection, here's my contribution. This happens in seminars, it happens in coursework, it happens in colloquium, right? It happens at APAs, right? So I'm thinking that this is not like, you know, get serious about philosophy's vices hour, but the idea could be something like there's something to Ethics Bowl that forces that in a way that classroom interventions in philosophy often don't.
So there's a lot of great things popping up in the chat here. And so Richard made a fantastic point about teamwork is an important aspect of what happens here. And it's not the kind of practice that tends to happen in a lot of philosophy courses. And the deep dive in terms of a collective analysis of the team really focusing on that. And then Tajasi also made some really great points about the interpersonal skills and the fact that you're formulating arguments by working with a group of students that are your close friends, right? So there's a different investment perhaps in that versus just looking at an argument in a critical thinking class where you don't really know the people in the class. You don't really know the folks sitting next to you. You're analyzing an argument perhaps in a really abstract way. It's on the board, it's logical structure, but you're not really engaging in that process together. So this is an interesting idea in terms of thinking about how we would show or try to pull out or demonstrate the success of what the Ethics Bowl is doing. You know, I don't know how we would track something like teamwork, but maybe that's a way to look at an employer evaluation is how well folks involve. Maybe this is something we could get from judge or coaches, excuse me, having coaches maybe evaluate in a pre and post how well their teams have done from the very beginning to the end of the season, if they're engaging in more teamwork or collaborative analysis. Just trying to think of how to translate some of these really great thoughts into something concrete. We want to collect those great stories of what's transformative, but we also want to be able to have some kind of proof to offer folks outside our community that, yeah, we're doing cool things, which are really valuable and are not done elsewhere. Brooke, yes.
Yes, I wonder if there is a way to think about getting Ethics Bowl to also focus on the accessibility or the of the language that gets used in the rounds, which they can then carry out into their social life, personal life, and work life. I mean, one of my concerns with, I mean, I loved my philosophy graduate work. I love the publications I did, the teaching of it, but it seems to me that a lot of times in philosophy, what you want to do is you want to build up specialization and a vocabulary that works for the problems and that shows you the wonderful insights that Kant had or that Hegel had or that whatever. And so you're teaching the students and you're asking them questions on the exam. Can they use that language? And then if they walk out of the of your classroom and as an educated ethics philosopher and go to their boss and say, I think you're doing something wrong here, because I mean, imagine that you're a universal legislator and you're trying to make a law out of your action, and that may not, that is a way of making Kant's argument more accessible to people. If there would be a way of trying to build that into the judging instructions or the education of the coaches to say, this is one thing that we're interested in, and we're going to measure it by listening to the rounds as they go on and see whether people fall back on what they assume are philosophy terms that other philosophers know, or can they in a brief way explain to us or the judges what those terms mean, and do it in language that everyone, and you look at some of the ethics centers and you see the translations of standard ethics principles or tests into ordinary language, and some of those are really good. I mean, they catch the essence of what what Kant was saying, or what Mill was saying, and put it in a language that you could actually use. I mean, so that's my question, I guess.
Yeah, we need to develop a philosophical swear jar.
Yep.
Put in a dollar. This is actually a good fundraising angle too. You have to put in $1 every time. So Jordan, go ahead.
That's a wonderful response. I love that. Obviously there are smart people working in this world. Anyway, as I say, that's a concern of mine.
Yeah. Jordan, did you have a thought on this front?
Yeah, I mean, just like I totally understand and get, a lot of the motivation to find like these measures and to, communicate those measures to people outside of Ethics Bowl. But I kind of just feel like at the end of the day, a lot of the value and good is just, it's not demonstrable in that way. And that's just kind of a feature of doing philosophy. And you see that a lot too, that what's good about it, it's just really hard to show to other people. And like, I wouldn't want to pervert this beautiful thing, Ethics Bowl, by trying to kind of like demonstrate how good it is to other people. And I keep coming back to something that I think John said at the very, very beginning, like try to have a public one, try to set one up at your school where you can invite administrators in or people from other departments. If you have 2 teams, have them scrimmage and invite people, or have a students versus faculty one. But I mean, I'm always just struck by when I'm there seeing it like, this is so awesome and valuable. And I think that's just a really effective way, I think, to show other people the value, and for other people to sort of see success conditions, like, oh, let me see like a really good match, or let me watch the national one on YouTube, and then I can kind of measure, where I'm at relative to that.
Yeah.
That's a great point. And Richard, you had a point to raise as well.
Oh, yeah, it was just in response to what Brooke said. I don't know how significant it is, but one of the things that's sort of nice about Ethics Bowl is most of the judges are not philosophers.
Right.
Maybe at some of the regional competitions, they skew in the opposite direction. But, teams learn very early on that if they can't put things in language that everyone understands, or explain the technical language in ways, that don't detract from the point that they're trying to make, that they're going to be very much in trouble. So I think it's a real virtue of Ethics Bowl that, we say be as philosophical as you want, but don't rely on it. Don't name drop, don't theory drop, and don't use theories that you haven't or aren't able to explain, or do so at your own peril.
Yeah. Good. on the note of peril, I'm perilously close to 4 o'clock, and I'm tasked with keeping us on schedule. So
We are
I think
there.
this has been a really great conversation, and I think, you know, like both in the area of like kind of thinking somewhat abstractly about like what the hypotheses about the core values are, and then thinking a little more concretely about some of these methods. I think both of those conversations have advanced in meaningful, if not altogether measurable ways, in this session. So I thank you for your participation and your feedback. This is really helpful as we as a kind of leadership team think about where we want to take this stuff. So thank you all for your contributions today. Michael, is there anything you'd like to say in the way of
I just
closing
want
us
to say
out for the
thank you
day?
for everybody for participating, and just to remind you that we will have day 2 tomorrow starting at 9 a.m. Pacific time and 12 p.m. Eastern time. And I hope to see all of you there for tomorrow. So we have a few more sessions I think are going to be really useful. So like I said, thank you all for being here, and we'll see you all tomorrow morning or afternoon for some of you.